Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi Achint. I have with me one of my favorite maritime analysts, uh, retired veteran Vice Admiral Anup Singh. I have learnt a lot from sir over the past year with regards to maritime affairs, China, and especially the Chinese Navy. Some stuff that sir told us still rings around on YouTube. And trust me when I say this, those videos are still getting views with regards to when we actually discuss the reality of the Chinese Navy. So, sir, namaskar. Welcome back to the show. Always a pleasure to have you, sir.
Pleasure's mine too, Adi.
Sir, I want to ask you, firstly, what do you, as a person who served in the Navy for such a long time, when you see the Navy, and might I say your Navy, in the oceans, sustained operations, let's talk about the Western, I'd call it the Western Indian Ocean. A lot of people will call it the Arabian Sea and this and that. But the Western Indian Ocean region, you have been doing operations for the past 4 months. And these are not small scale operations, large operations, along with exercises, along with aircraft carriers, submarines, patrols, destroyers, frigates, everything has been on port. And on top of that, you've done anti piracy operations, you've done search and rescue, whole lot of things. So, how do you see the overall situation? How's the Navy kind of performing today, sir?
You're right, Adi. But there's an old saying you know, when the chips are down, only the brave get going, and the brave reap success. So we've had something called mission-based deployments, as you know, since 2017, which had only splattering of warships in the North Indian Ocean, in fact, part of South as well, which included 7 spots starting from the Persian Gulf, where we had 1 to 2 at times, but not all the time, because we are really trying to stretch our skin to meet numbers in the Indian Ocean, because Indian Ocean is made up of choke points, and all these areas which have got problems are because they are very close in close proximity to choke points. You can look at what has been happening in Hormuz since 1988 and what's happened recently. Why is it a problem? Because after all, 40% of oil and gas of the world comes out of
Comes
the Strait of Hormuz, and a hell of a lot of exchanged goods, modern goods bought by petrodollars go into the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. So it's a pricey catch for anyone who wants to be either a little nasty, like non-state actors have been doing, or someone among state actors who wants to show that they hold all the strings because of the gateway to the Persian Gulf. So that's been an area of great concern, and therefore we've always put our best foot forward whenever there is a where there is a requirement to protect sea lines of communication, not just our own, which are very critical, because 40% of our GDP is supported by import and export by sea. Now, fortunately, even though we have had a very serious shortfall of numbers since the numbers pegged at 138 by the Emergency Committee of the Cabinet of 1963, we have never breached that figure. I mentioned this earlier. Yet, very fortunately, we've had a lot of legacy platforms replaced in the last couple of years by indigenously developed and indigenously designed major platforms like the Delhi class destroyers, the Talwar class frigates, and a lot of other platforms, including UAVs and P-8I aircraft and some helicopters. So it's been just in time that we have had some operational and cutting edge technologies available, where therefore we were able to spare them. So when it came to such a crunch, we had no alternative but to deploy forces in numbers, because only deterrence works and only actual live fire works. And that's what we did, because that really scared the hell out of these people who were trying to be extra nasty. So you have seen there is therefore decline of um, the troubles that were brewing for almost everybody, not just Indian shipping but others. When it comes to the other side, the Bay of Bengal, um, we've always been very conscious of the fact that the Chinese have been up to some tricks for a long time. First, by
Mm.
sending in smaller craft in the 90s, then in the early 2000s. And now they have started sending some submarines as well. And we always detect them because they can't sustain for too long, whether they are conventional or they are nuclear powered. They can't sustain for too long inside the Indian Ocean because it's too far away from home. Secondly, the Malacca Strait does not have, hideouts.
Mm.
So anybody who travels through the Malacca Strait, particularly submarines, has to come on the surface. So they don't come through the Malacca Strait unless they are going on goodwill visits. They
Mm.
come out of the Lombok or Sunda quietly, which is not legal because there is an international law rule which says that submarines must transit international straits on surface. The Chinese don't try and do that because they want to hide themselves. They don't realize that they get caught and they are trapped. So that's where we stand. We are actually stretching our resources since the beginning because we haven't got the numbers and we don't want to divert critical resources for unnecessary patrolling, unnecessary reconnaissance. But then these are national security needs. Can't just help it. That's what happens.
So when we see the Houthis and the way that they've carried out the, if I may say, a blockade of the Red Sea, the traffic is still on, but there's a huge amount of scare and there's a certain amount of apprehension within the sailors and within the captains of the ships of merchant vessels to actually cross that area, and there is a apprehension within sailing companies to cross that area. That tells you that somebody with a very very little amount of power can, a little amount of force, little amount of power, little amount of weaponry, very low tech stuff can actually block high end, high tech equipment of navies, and which is quite a dangerous thing. So how does the Indian Navy kind of look at preparing oneself for such a scenario in terms of a defense? And could these tactics also be used as an offensive within us, within our the proverbial the gate of steel, as the Chinese call it, in the Malacca and the other straits?
Yeah. As I said in one of your previous shows, that, one is reminded of Che Guevara and guerrilla warfare. But that, really speaking, was for a very good nationalist cause, strictly
Mhm.
speaking, even though it wasn't part
Wasn't, yeah,
of
what
warfare.
it is. Mm.
But um, people like Houthis, who really speaking should be labeled as non-state actors, even though they are
Mhm.
funded or supported by certain states. As I said, firstly, there has been no military education. There is no education on legalities of warfare, and
Mhm.
they do it deliberately at the behest of certain people, maybe states. It's the cheapest option to do proxy warfare, and they know that since they don't claim to be part of any state which has declared war on any other state or on international shipping, they don't have to fear retribution. But the fact is, even though they did receive retribution from the US and the UK when they bombed out some of their through the air campaign, you remember in November, December last year, into their hideouts in Yemen. But the fact is that um, the Houthis are doing, having learned from what the Somalis did in the years 2006 to 2012. What was the result of the Somali piracy? Once again, most of them could be called non-state actors because it was not, there was no, there was no government, there was no governance in Somalia at that time. In
Correct.
fact, the UN
Correct.
resolution said that this transitional government is not really effective and everybody is allowed to go in if he wants to prosecute these people who are doing something unlawful, pirates, etc. So it is the easiest cheap option that they have realized when Somalis used to hijack ships and take them into one of the into part of the coastline, the Yemen coastline, into the Somali coastline. Some of
Somali
them even
coastline.
went close to Yemen, and then used to seek ransom. Now, what did the Houthis learn? The World Bank and the UNDP, sorry, not UN, UNODC, the drug organization that finds out what is the cost to the global economy or national economies because of the menace of drug trafficking. There are about $18 billion a year were being paid by global economies, by national economies, the world, as the headache, the burden cost of piracy in the Gulf of Aden, in the Strait of Bab el Mandab. That's why you and I have had to pay more to the shippies for as salaries, more as insurance premium on ships. Do you know that Lloyd's at that time in the year 2010 or 11 claimed that between 10 and 12, insurance premiums had climbed ninefold for shipping that passed through the Bab el Mandab. Now, you and I had to pay for it
Even now we are
because
paying for it. 30.
shipping
Mm.
companies are not going to not going to pay out of some God sent
Goodwill.
funds. They will have to charge either the supplier or the recipient, which means the customer. Now, the Houthis seem to have realized the value of that part of shipping which passes through the Red Sea. Theoretically, it used to be 12%. It came to about 20%. You remember what happened when Evergreens, one of the largest container ships carrying about 20,000 plus containers, got stuck at right angles in the Suez Canal. 6 days meant $45 billion because people had to go all around the Cape of Good Hope. Many were stuck in Port Said for days on end, who had already come from Strait of Gibraltar to Port Said waiting for the Suez to open. Same way, people who were northbound were waiting in Port Suez at the southern end of the Suez Canal. And many shipping companies diverted around the Cape of Good Hope, which meant 15 to 20 days of extra passage, and time meant money, plus extra fuel. So there's a huge cost to all this. Same thing has happened with the because of the Houthi attacks. And the Houthis are doing it deliberately. Of course, at the behest of certain people who are saying these, these are the advantages of doing this, and this is how you'll be paid back. So it's a great lesson for these idiots. I'm so sorry to use this word, an unparliamentary word. And that's what they did. They emulated what happened during piracy.
No, so that word is
Cost
actually a
to
little.
shipping, cost to global shipping, a burden on global economy. It is
Correct.
worse than what happened during the Iran-Iraq war to oil prices. It is worse than what happened, almost similar to what happened in the early 70s because of the oil blockade, 1973,
Mm,
74.
mm, mm.
You remember petrol prices from 1 rupee 25 paisa jumped to 7 rupees in no time in India or later,
Correct.
in
All over
less
the
than a
world,
year.
actually. All over the
Yes,
world,
yes.
this was a problem. Yes.
So it's exactly the same.
How about you, us using something like this as an offensive tactic, sir?
Uh, as I said, first of all, it is not legal. Secondly, uh, if you're saying that something similar when it
When in
comes to
times
a
of
currency
conflict.
control,
Mm.
yes, when the chips are down, yes, most certainly. And we've got things of this nature up our sleeve, and we have warned people who have a habit of at least two such powers who have a habit of casting an evil eye on India, one to the west of the peninsula and one to the east.
Mhm.
We've made no bones about this part of strategy in our track two conferences to say, don't forget, your Achilles heel lies in so and so area. For example, let me be very clear that 80% of China's oil and gas passes through the Indian Ocean close to the Indian Peninsula. 65 to 70% of the finished products, the world's manufacturing shop floor, passes very close to the Indian Peninsula. And
That's correct.
despite the Indian Ocean being the smallest water body and being full of only choke points as access and entry gates, there is no alternative for them to pass through the Indian
Hmm.
Ocean, whether they want to go to west or from west come to the east.
East.
So
So
this
when
sort
we
of
see,
strategy is very well known to them. I mean,
sir,
Hu Jintao said in 2004 about they talked about the Malacca dilemma. Well, what will
yes,
they
sir.
do? It's not easy to build the Kra Canal
Yeah.
at an estimated cost at that time meaning about 10, 12 years ago, when they started talking about it. And somebody in Thailand was also very enthused about it, that we'll make some revenue. Um, at that time, the cost was billed at $25 billion. And what about the compulsory pilotage, which shipping companies will have to pay in order to cross, just like the Suez Canal? It's a huge cost to ships
And why
to cross the
why
Suez
would you
Canal.
use that, sir? Why would you use the Krakenal when there is a perfectly fine route going on the side? Why would I want to pay extra
Absolutely.
piloting costs and time and this and that? I
Absolutely.
just go 150
Absolutely.
miles ahead and take a damn turn.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's
It's
what I'm
not the
saying. Like
you know.
the like the Suez Canal got blocked on one occasion by Evergreen, on another occasion by somebody else having collided. At that time, it was just about a day and a half because the ship
Ah.
didn't run again. But this time it was terrible. Six
Mm,
days,
mm.
and on ships which are large, which are heading a convoy. Large ships are always made to head a convoy, including oil tankers, etc. And particularly a ship like the Evergreen, uh, which was carrying about 20,000 plus containers. It's always put in the lead of a convoy, whether southbound or north. And the lead ship is always headed by somebody called the chief pilot. There are so many hundreds of pilots in the Suez Canal. They are all experts, but it's always an expert who's there. Despite him being there, there was a strong desert wind blowing, which veered the ship to one side. But that was not the real cause. The real cause is because such a heavy ship draws a lot of draft. That means its bottom really goes down. And when that happens, you create a bow wave within a constricted space called the canal. That bow wave has a habit of going, veering to the right or the left. If it goes to the left and you use the correction wheel, that means you use the rudder on the opposite side, the effect is opposite to what one thinks. Then you go out of
Oh,
control. That's exactly what seemed to have happened. So he almost broached at right angles. And finally his bows came unstuck on the bottom, even though the Suez Canal was dredged, as you know, in 2018
yeah.
and
Mm,
widened.
mm. So when we see powers like China today, who are also deployed in the same region, and they are part of that, I won't call it the coalition, but the grouping of countries that were supposed to fight piracy. I haven't seen or read one report where a Chinese ship has been the first responder, been anything of that sort. And it's not that they are operating far away from base. They've got a base in Djibouti. They've been right there. What does that tell you about one, their maritime capability, and two, their mindset, sir?
I think it's a very good question, Adi. I must, that reminds me of a fact when I had a discussion with some experts from the US Navy, very senior people, and also elsewhere, um, about professionalism. And that hasn't gained ground in their Navy. Firstly, because of conscription,
Hmm.
unlike our Navy, where there is no conscription except for a little bit now because of Agniveers, but they are at a very low level. And they are still being trained pretty well, and they are not allowed to graduate, suddenly jump up with double promotions. And therefore, the backbone of a Navy is not just the senior sailors, that is JCOs in the Army. In the three services, the backbone is really the middle level, which means, for example, in the Navy, there is a rank called leading seaman and petty officers.
Petty officers.
Uh, The bulk of the Navy, of course, is below leading seamen. That means seamen first class and seamen second class. That means a sailor with about 4 to 8 years of experience in the Navy is the bank that we are calling the backbone. And of course, it is strengthened most strongly, most firmly by the senior sailors who have a lot of experience. Now, that doesn't seem to have gained ground in China, in the PLA Navy, in all three services because of
Hmm.
conscription. And they haven't had experience, rarely speaking. You remember when they got the blunt nose in Vietnam in 1979 with a much smaller force?
Mhm.
And you remember the story of the Cu Chi Tunnel
Yeah.
near Ho Chi Minh City. So that's where brain power counts a lot, not numbers.
Hmm.
And because of the blunt nose, they had to retreat. They didn't have a face to show, even though a lot of the tactics by the Vietnamese had been learned by them during the Vietnam War out of innovation.
Yeah.
Now, the Chinese are not, first of all, not professional. Secondly, you asked a very pertinent question about why is it that you don't see any action by them, is it deliberate or otherwise? The first incident when the Chinese got embarrassed in the incident of piracy against one of their ships was in August 2008. And when the Indian Navy came to their rescue, one of the merchant ships were, and then they profusely thanked the government of India for having saved their ship from being hijacked. It is an Indian Navy ship's helicopter which went up and fired against the mother skiff, mother boat, and that's how the pirates ran away. A second incident took place in November of that year, 2008. They were again very seriously embarrassed. That is a time that they thought it is a huge burden on the exchequer to go 10,000 kilometers away from home bases. And instead of one ship, they sent three ships. But that was a God sent opportunity because till now they haven't retrieved themselves from there. So there is a very legitimate excuse, and that's why they keep saying that they made a Djibouti base only for supporting anti-piracy action, patrols. It's a very good excuse. But they haven't been seen in action anywhere. Despite having three ships, there is no other navy which
Nothing.
in anti-piracy patrol has more than one ship. Even the EU NAV force, EU NAV 4 they call it, they used to have maximum 1 to 2 ships. These
Hmm.
guys have a logistic ship or a tanker to support their fleet and two other frigates or destroyers. And we haven't heard or seen anything, any action on it, except for doing operational turnaround in an Omani port once in a while into the Persian Gulf on friendship cruise for the same fellows going in, or on their way back calling at some East African ports and
Hmm.
doling out certain goodies in the name of education for the poor and so on. So they are on a different trip.
You also see the same kind of attitude by the Pakistanis. But the Chinese, when when you save a sailor from the Chinese, they at least thank you. The Pakistanis don't even do that. I believe the
No,
Pakistanis, in the first instant, when we rescued that Iranian ship, the first
yeah.
instant the Pakistanis were close to the ship. They just switched off their transponders and went away. And that to me is really amazing. How can you do that in the middle of an ocean? I mean,
One doesn't really have to go too far to talk about them because you remember in the year 2014 when I think the name of the frigate was PNS Zulfikar, which was
ah,
which was there was an attempted hijack by one of their own sailors and six other ex-sailors
hmm,
who came in a Gemini craft, and the sailor on board was the one who was in support. Very fortunately for them, and I say not only for them, for the rest of the naval world
region.
around them, including
Mhm.
us. Very fortunately, the ship was doing what we call sea in action. That means prepare for going to sea. Whether that is an activity which is done just before putting to sea. It starts about 4 hours before you actually sail out. So it is preparation, testing out all combat systems, testing out logistic support systems, testing out manpower in combat drills and in firefighting in case there is an accident or an incident or a crisis. It takes about 4 hours. Now, you do it once in a while in harbor. Also, if the ship has not been sailing for a long time, in order to keep them in tune
Hmm.
with that activity. So whether they were preparing to put to sea or otherwise, most probably they were preparing to put to sea. And that's why they were alive. And they had their sentries and other systems fully armed. So their sentries were able to carry out live firing against the Gemini which came in front with their own ex-sailors. And these guys turned out to be um, recruits of ISIS after having left the Navy. So, they had such huge alarm bells,
Yeah,
not only in
that
the
was a crazy
Pakistan Navy,
story
but also
because they wanted to take that ship back to Syria actually.
yeah,
So when we coming towards the end of this thing, I want to ask you now, sir, with regards to the capabilities that the Indian Navy needs to look at. There's obviously a talk of a third aircraft carrier. There's obviously talks of further development of the uh, uh, the IAC 3, which is I think going to get clearance by June July in the updated budget which will be coming in. Uh, there are talks of the nuclear submarines. There are talks happening with Germany, with Spain on the API, on the batteries, on whole lot of stuff, and we see a lot of movement, especially in that aspect. What should the Navy focus more on, sir, today? What is the need, uh, considering that you will need to kind of hold the Indian Ocean, especially in this region? And I also know that we are looking at southern deployment somewhere. We've got now a base in Algeria, in Mauritius. We've got Assumption. We are looking at doing a deal with the Diego Garcia. So the deployment is only increasing. So what would you kind of advise to the Indian Navy, saying this is what we should look at going forward?
Adi, I've been saying that I become a contrarian to my own view about technology replacing
Well,
numbers,
that's very
quality
open
replacing
of you, sir.
quantity.
I must say that's very open and wise of anybody to say that,
But there is a reason why I keep saying this.
sir.
Uh, because the Indian Ocean, as I said, despite being the smallest ocean, is it's like, you know, saying that terrorism was born here, which is a fact in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
perhaps because it has some of the least developed countries around,
Hmm.
some of the very, very lowly developed countries, not just economically, even otherwise, like look at Somalia, poor thing. There was nothing called governance in that country for almost 2 decades, from the 90s onwards. And that's what
Correct.
led to piracy. That's what led to fishermen having become pirates and many having turned towards other forms of, um, other forms of breadwinners, um, adopting uh, vocations like drug running, gun running, or whatever else. But we have survived. Yet, because of there being 9 choke points, starting from a half choke point called the Cape of Good Hope, even though it is not a full choke, the Mozambique Channel, the Bab el Mandab, the Suez
Hmm.
Canal, the Strait of Hormuz, the Lombok, Malacca, and the Sunda Straits, and the Strait of Mumbai Veta. These are the only access and entry routes into or out of the Indian Ocean.
Correct.
Therefore, and it is only choke points which give rise to transnational crime, be it gun running, drug running, human trafficking, piracy, and maritime terrorism. Now you have to guard against all this. And which is the navy in the Indian Ocean? Which are the navies in the Indian Ocean? Which can look after protection of global shipping and its own shipping? Counted few. Australia too far away, South Africa too far away, but The most powerful amongst all these in numbers as well as in potency is the Indian Navy. It can't, it cannot be expected to look after the entire North Indian Ocean alone, leave apart the entire Indian.
Hmm.
So, if you include, let's say, the Israeli Defense Forces, the naval wing, which is also not very large,
Yeah.
there are just about three or four. Now, therefore, we require a lot of numbers, despite the fact that I keep saying, and many other people keep saying, as technology gallops, keeping in pace with the speed of light, we need to look at quality rather than quantity, and we need to look at technology rather than numbers. But in the Indian Ocean, because of geographical configuration
You
and
also need
because of
numbers.
constraints of flow points, you need numbers as well for presence.
Yep.
Just like
Just
your
sheer
first
presence.
question, how are we affording so many numbers all the time because of the Houthi attacks in October, November?
True. Absolutely.
We cannot,
Hmm.
I keep saying that we need to be very careful about platform fatigue apart from crew fatigue. You haven't got the numbers to burn them out in asymmetric challenges,
Correct.
in non-traditional warfare like we are facing right now. Expensive platforms, but we have no alternative. Therefore, we need numbers. Therefore, we really need to boost our strength. Just forget about 138 we haven't breached since 1964, since the emergency committee of the cabinet. Just like the Air Force has not breached 42 fighter squadrons. We not only need to breach 138, we need to finally achieve very large numbers, not just of warships on surface, but also UAVs like the
Hmm.
MQ-9s, also P-8I and smaller aircraft, the AWACS and the eyes in the sky of smaller nature,
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
so
Anti-sub
that you
and
can keep everything under surveillance all the time. It's an expensive game, but you have to find ways to afford this game. Perhaps unmanned vehicles is the answer for the future, but you need these numbers. And that's why you cannot also at the same time forget traditional threats. They are not gone away.
hmm.
Look at our neighbor to the west and the neighbor to the north. And insofar as maritime domain is concerned, it becomes neighbor to the east. I'm talking of Pakistan and China. Those threats are not never going to go away. So you need to look after traditional threats as well all the time, which means that you need a three carrier force, not just because it is nice to have. Because of temperature, salinity, humidity of the worst kind in the Indian Ocean, you will always have one third of your force in maintenance, refits. So to have two operational carrier groups, you require three, and not old, laggard, sustained by Jugaad, but three contemporary carrier groups, which means three aircraft carriers, minimum. Not just because China is building 12 or 6 or 8. We are not trying to compete with China. We have to look after, we are competing with our own threats. We have to cope with those threats. Therefore,
Hmm.
traditional threats wise, as well as for non-traditional threats, you need, seeing is believing at sea. You need
Correct.
forces like the carriers. When you have three carrier battle groups or three carrier strike groups, you will have what we call escorts as standalone task forces as well. Those same units get used as standalone task forces when the carrier is not moving as a strike. Apart from
Hmm.
that, you need a lot of destroyers, frigates, and corvettes and patrol craft for the mid-range, the near coast, as well as the deep sea. These numbers are really required. And when it comes to submarining, once again, thank God we adopted nuclear power for propulsion a long time ago, and finally the fruits are now, being reaped, though at a slow pace. We need nuclear power for not just SSBNs, ballistic missile carrying submarines, but also for SSNs, attack submarines. They are the ones who will finally enable us fighting less than heavy wars.
Mm.
because it is
Mhm.
attack submarine which will never have to surface and will have a lot of endurance. And the enemy will be warned before he tries anything which is nasty. It will be forewarned because it knows that those submarines are not going to surface and not get detected. They will carry conventional weapons more than nuclear weapons, but they will have a lot of endurance. Similarly, for what we call as not so deep water operations, we also need conventional submarines, of which we have had a lot of shortfall. So the Project 75, which has produced Scorpions, the sixth one is just about to get commissioned, was supposed to have been followed by Project 75 India, which hasn't taken off. And it is for that reason that we are looking all across. But the last point I would like to make in this respect is, I hate to say this, but I am totally against this business of uh, pegging indigenization at 79% or 69% or 89%. You cannot do import substitution in a jiffy. You first have to harness technology, and we missed the industrial revolution. Therefore,
Mhm.
a lot of propulsion systems and a lot of weapon systems are still being imported. Very fortunately, out of the three services, the Navy adopted the strategy of a builder's Navy rather than a buyer's Navy, even before the Royal Indian Navy became the Indian Navy. And we said
Wow.
this will be our aim. That is why from 1965 onwards, we had three shipyards as defense PSUs, and the fourth one became a defense PSU, HSL, in 2009. Because the aim was to build everything at home. But everything must have every component also being built at home so that you are not dependent on foreign parts in times of
Mm.
crisis,
Mm.
which means the critical element of propulsion. You have certain diesel engines being made in India, but they are they are under license. For example, from the French. You have some gas turbines being made in India in HAL, but they are again under license from an American, a very well known, the GE
Mm.
gas turbines, the LM series, LM2500, which are being
Yes.
fitted already on not only the first aircraft carrier which came out of Cochin shipyard, but also on some destroyers. But you have to keep depending on a lot of other small things on imports. You cannot say that only that 79% of the budget for all three services will have to be for indigenous. Then you will have to keep waiting and keep rolling from year to year. And as you know, in
Mm.
the Indian system, anything that is unspent goes into the Consolidated Fund of India for the next, not for the next year, but for a new budget. You don't have a rollover system.
That is the funny part. I think they should make a consolidated fund of India for the armed forces. That is one, and I think they need to create also a fund where any drugs that are caught, all that fund goes into.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You just hit the nail on the head. For years, not only us, but the Army and the Air Force have been fighting, but that wherever there is an effort by the services which earns revenue, or where the government receives
Right.
money for having provided services, must be plowed back into the service. But that is a rule which says that any revenue earned because of services rendered to a foreign government or to an Indian private sector or PSU, that goes into the consolidated fund. For
That's
example,
what I think.
training.
Hmm.
For example,
Yeah, yeah.
training of foreigners.
Hmm.
So that's a rule which
Training,
is
protection,
must
whole lot of
be.
things that we do,
Yes,
escorting,
yes,
fuel, this, that, all that money
that's
should go
right.
into the.
That's right.
Sir, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I've been wanting to speak to you about the Indian Navy. It's really impressive what the Navy is being doing. We're all proud of it, and just to hope that the Navy keeps the
Hmm.
uh, is able to actually keep up. Yeah, I'm sure the people will go out and beyond in terms of their capability. I think the Navy should be able to keep up and, of course, exceed and excel in what it's doing. And of course, your thought of the I 75I is, of course, I think, stone in the eye of a lot of us who actually watch this. We are quite concerned, but I hope things do move forward in the next year with the coming budget. On that note, sir, thank you so much. Always a pleasure, and I'll see you next time.
Thank
Jai
you,
Hind.
Adi. Thank you so much.